the bride, the forest, and the Duke, who waited. The morning of Lady Arabella Fenwick's wedding dawned in shades of gold and ivory, as though the sky itself had dressed for the occasion. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of Fenwick Hall, warming the floorboards and catching the dust motes that drifted lazily through the air of her dressing chamber. She stood before the mirror while her maid, Clara, worked the long row of pearl buttons at the back of her gown, a confection of ivory silk and hand-stitched lace that had taken a seamstress in London 3 months to complete. The veil, a gossamer thing edged with silver thread, had been worn by her mother, and her mother's mother before that. It smelled faintly of lavender and old cedar, the scent of a trunk that had been opened and closed across generations of Fenwick brides. Everything was as it should have been. The dress was exquisite. The flowers had arrived. The church was prepared. 200 guests were already assembling in the pews of St. Andrew's, adjusting their hats and whispering to one another about what a fortunate match it was. And the groom, Lord Philip Ashcroft, was no doubt standing at the altar at this very moment, impeccable in his morning coat, smiling that practiced, effortless smile that had charmed every drawing-room from Kent to Edinburgh. Arabella should have felt joy. She should have felt the giddy, breathless anticipation that every bride was meant to feel on this morning above all mornings. Instead, she felt a hollow ache in her chest, as though something essential had been quietly removed in the night and replaced with cold air. "You look beautiful, my lady," Clara said softly, smoothing a crease in the veil. "Lord Ashcroft is a very fortunate man." "Thank you, Clara." The words came automatically, a reflex polished by years of saying the appropriate thing at the appropriate time. But as Arabella stared at her reflection, the woman, looking back at her, seemed like a stranger wearing a costume, and the stranger's eyes kept drifting to the middle distance, to a memory 6 months old that she had tried, with considerable effort and no success, to forget. Duke Sebastian Hale had proposed to her in the spring. He had done it in his library at Hale Park, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling shelves of books he had actually read, standing beside a window that overlooked the rolling green of his estate. There had been no kneeling, no rehearsed speech, no ring produced from a velvet box with theatrical timing. He had simply stood before her, with his hands at his sides, and his grey eyes steady, and said, with the directness that defined everything about him, "Lady Arabella, I hold you in the highest regard. I believe we could build a life of substance and meaning together. I am asking you to be my wife." That was Sebastian. No ornament, no performance, a man who dealt in facts and actions the way other men dealt in compliments and flattery. He was 32, wealthy beyond comfortable discussion, respected across 3 counties for his intelligence, his integrity, and his tireless work reforming labor conditions on rural estates. He was handsome, though it was the kind of handsomeness you had to look at twice to fully appreciate. Strong features, a serious mouth, dark hair that fell across his forehead when he was deep in thought, eyes that missed nothing and revealed little. He was also, by the standards of polite society, profoundly dull. He rarely attended balls. He never danced unless cornered into it by a hostess, who would not take no for an answer. He had no interest in gossip, no patience for pretense, and no talent whatsoever for the kind of sparkling, effortless charm that society valued above nearly everything else. He spent his days managing his estates, corresponding with parliamentarians about agricultural reform, and reading, always reading, as though the world's problems could be solved if one simply consumed enough information about them. Arabella had been 21 and full of ideas about what love was supposed to look like. Love was supposed to be thrilling. It was supposed to arrive with music and moonlight and declarations that made your pulse race. It was supposed to feel like flying, not like being offered a sensible partnership by a man who spoke about marriage the way he spoke about crop rotation. She had refused him, gently but firmly. She had told him they would not suit, that she needed someone more aligned with her temperament, someone who could match her appetite for society and laughter and spontaneity. He had listened without interrupting. He had nodded once. He had thanked her for her honesty, wished her well, bowed, and left. She had not seen him since. 3 months later, Lord Philip Ashcroft had appeared in her life, like an answer to a prayer she hadn't realized she was praying. He was everything Sebastian was not. Charming, sociable, effortlessly witty. The kind of man who could make an entire dinner table laugh with a single well-timed remark. He courted her with flowers and poetry and whispered compliments that made her blush. Her father, Lord Fenwick, approved enthusiastically. The engagement was swift, the wedding was arranged, and now Arabella stood in her bridal gown 6 hours from becoming Lady Ashcroft, and she could not stop thinking about a quiet man in a library who had offered her something real and watched her turn it down. "My lady, the carriages are ready," Clara said. "Your father is waiting." Arabella drew a long breath, adjusted her veil, and descended the grand staircase. Lord Fenwick stood at the bottom, a large man with greying hair and the kind of stern bearing that softened only in the presence of his daughter. When he saw her, his eyes went glassy. "You are the image of your mother," he said, his voice rough at the edges. Arabella's mother had died when she was 11. The wound had scarred over but never fully healed. "Thank you, Papa." He offered his arm and led her outside to the wedding carriage, a white lacquered affair festooned with roses and trailing ribbons. She climbed in. Her father settled across from her. The driver spoke to the horses, and they began the familiar route to St. Andrews, a road that wound through the ancient forest bordering the Fenwick estate. The forest was beautiful that morning. Oaks and beeches formed a cathedral of green overhead, their branches interlocking to filter the sunlight into a shifting mosaic of gold and shadow. On the road below, birds sang from invisible perches. The air smelled of damp earth and wild garlic and the particular green freshness that only old forests possess. Arabella found herself wishing the journey would never end, that the carriage would simply keep rolling through this tunnel of light and leaf forever, suspending her between the life she was leaving and the one she was about to enter. They were perhaps halfway through the forest when the carriage lurched violently to a stop. Arabella was thrown forward against the opposite seat. Her father caught her arm to steady her, then reached for the door, his face darkening with anger. "What in God's name?" The answer came from outside, not from the driver, from a voice that was low, unhurried, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Step out of the carriage, Lord Fenwick, slowly, and we'll see about letting you keep breathing." Arabella's father went rigid. She had never seen fear on his face before, not once in her life, but she saw it now, sharp and unmistakable, flashing across his features before he could suppress it. He looked at her. "Stay behind me," he said. "Do not speak." He opened the door and stepped down onto the road. Arabella followed, ignoring his command, because something in the quality of the silence outside told her that obedience would not protect her from what was coming. 6 men on horseback formed a semicircle around the carriage. They wore dark clothing and cloth masks that covered everything below the eyes. Each held a pistol with the casual confidence of men who had used them before and would not hesitate to use them again. The driver was slumped sideways on his bench, a bloom of red spreading across the shoulder of his coat. Unconscious, Arabella prayed. Not dead. The leader sat the largest horse, a raw-boned bay with a scarred flank. He was broad through the shoulders, and his visible eyes were pale and flat, the eyes of a man for whom other people's suffering was simply a feature of the landscape. "Money won't buy you out of this one, Lord Fenwick," the leader said. "It's the girl we've come for." Arabella felt the ground shift beneath her. Her father stepped in front of her, his body becoming a wall. "You will not touch her." "Touching is exactly the wrong word. We're taking her whole and unharmed, provided you cooperate." He gestured to 2 of his men. "Get the bride." What followed happened in fragments, sharp and disjointed, like a mirror shattering in slow motion. Her father shouting, a pistol butt striking his temple. Blood, sudden and shocking, running into his eye. Her own scream, raw and animal, rough hands seizing her arms, the silk of her gown tearing at the shoulder as she fought. The smell of horses and leather and sweat. Her father on his knees in the dirt, one hand pressed to his bleeding head, reaching for her with the other. "Papa!" The leader's voice cut through the chaos. "Enough. Come quietly or he dies where he kneels." Arabella stopped struggling. She looked at her father. He was trying to stand, his face a mask of blood and anguish, and she knew with absolute certainty that these men would kill him without a moment's hesitation if she gave them cause. "I'll come," she said. Her voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. "Don't hurt him." They lifted her onto a horse. A man climbed up behind her, his arm clamping around her waist like an iron band. The leader leaned down toward Lord Fenwick, who was swaying on his knees. "Tell Ashcroft his bride costs £50,000. We'll send word on where to deliver it. If he sends soldiers instead of money, he'll get her back in pieces." Then they were moving. The horses plunged into the forest, off the road, through undergrowth and between ancient trunks, moving fast and hard. Arabella looked back once and saw her father, small and broken in a shaft of sunlight, growing smaller with every hoofbeat until the trees swallowed him completely. They rode for what might have been an hour, though time had lost its meaning. The forest closed around them like a fist. The paths narrowed, disappeared, reformed. The men did not speak except in grunts and gestures, navigating by some internal map that led them deeper and deeper into terrain Arabella had never seen. They emerged finally into a clearing dominated by a derelict hunting lodge, its roof sagging, its windows dark and broken. It had the abandoned, defeated look of a building that had given up on being occupied. They pulled her from the horse and dragged her inside, down a narrow stone staircase, into a cellar that smelled of damp earth and rot. The walls were rough stone, the floor was packed dirt. A single barred window near the ceiling admitted a thin grey light that did nothing to warm the space. They left her there. The bolt slid home with a sound that was final, absolute, like the closing of a coffin lid. Arabella sank to the floor. Her ivory gown, the gown her mother's seamstress had labored over for 3 months, was torn and filthy, streaked with dirt and horse sweat and a smear of her father's blood at the shoulder, where she had tried to reach him. The veil was gone, ripped away during the struggle on the road. The pearl buttons Clara had fastened that morning were scattered and broken. She wrapped her arms around her knees and wept. She wept for her father, bleeding and helpless on the forest road. She wept for the absurdity of a morning that had begun with sunlight and silk, and ended in a cellar that smelled like a grave. And she wept because she knew, with a certainty that sat in her stomach like a stone, that Philip Ashcroft would not pay the ransom. She had known it for weeks, though she had refused to articulate the knowledge even to herself. Philip's courtship had been flawless in its execution, and entirely hollow in its substance. He wanted her father's wealth and connections. He wanted the Fenwick name attached to his ambitions. He did not want her. Not really. Not in any way that would survive the first moment his self-interest was tested. £50,000 was a great deal of money, and Philip Ashcroft was not a man who parted with anything that did not serve his advancement. She was going to die in this cellar. The understanding settled over her quietly, almost gently, the way snow settles. She would die here in a ruined wedding dress, alone, and the last face she would ever see would belong to a man in a mask who did not care whether she breathed or stopped breathing. Hours passed. The light from the window faded. Night came. The cold deepened. Arabella huddled against the wall, shivering violently, listening to the men above her, moving, talking, laughing among themselves, as though they had done nothing more remarkable that day than go to market. She dozed in fragments, jerking awake at every footstep, every creak. The darkness was total and disorienting. She lost track of time entirely. She might have been there for hours or days. The only constant was the cold and the smell of earth, and the distant, muffled sounds of men who held her life in their indifferent hands. She was somewhere between sleep and waking when she heard the horses, many horses approaching fast through the forest. Her body went rigid. Shouts erupted above her, chairs scraping, boots pounding on floorboards. Then the first gunshot, sharp and percussive, followed immediately by a second, a third, a volley. The sounds of violent collision, bodies hitting walls, furniture splintering, glass breaking, men screaming, more gunfire. The lodge shook with the force of it. Arabella pressed herself flat against the stone wall, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She could not tell if this was rescue or merely a different kind of catastrophe. The fighting lasted minutes that felt like hours, and then it stopped, as suddenly as it had started, replaced by a silence that roared. Footsteps on the stairs, the bolt drawn back, the door swinging open. A figure stood in the doorway, backlit by lamplight from the room above, tall, broad-shouldered, holding a pistol in one hand and a lantern in the other. For one terrible suspended moment, Arabella could not see his face, and every nightmare she had ever had converged in that silhouette. Then he stepped into the cellar and raised the lantern, and the light fell across features she knew as well as her own. Sebastian Hale, Duke of Hale Park. The man she had refused in a library 6 months ago with polite words that she would give anything at all to take back. He was covered in dust and what might have been blood, though she could not tell if it was his. His coat was torn at the sleeve, his dark hair was wild, his grey eyes, those steady, serious, unreadable eyes, were burning with something she had never seen in them before, something raw and uncontrolled that looked very much like fear. Their eyes met across the dark cellar, and neither of them spoke. The lantern trembled slightly in his hand, the only indication that the composure he wore like armor had been, for this moment at least, breached. Then he crossed the space between them in 3 strides and knelt beside her on the dirt floor. "Lady Arabella." His voice was rough, stripped of its usual measured calm. "Are you hurt? Did they harm you?" She shook her head. Words had fled. He was here. Despite everything, he was here. "Can you stand?" She nodded, and he helped her to her feet. Her legs buckled immediately, weak from hours of cold and terror. Without hesitation, without asking permission, he lifted her into his arms, gathering her ruined gown and all, and held her against his chest as though she were something precious that the world had tried to break and he would not allow it. "I have you," he said, quietly. "You are safe now." She buried her face against his shoulder and felt the solidity of him, the warmth, the steady rise and fall of his breathing, and something inside her that had been clenched for hours, for months, for years perhaps, finally released. She wept, not from fear this time, from the overwhelming, annihilating relief of being held by someone who had come for her when no one else would. He carried her out of the lodge and into the night. The clearing was controlled chaos, his men securing prisoners, tending wounds, leading horses. The leader of the kidnappers was on his knees in the dirt, his shoulder bleeding, his mask torn away to reveal a face that was ordinary and unremarkable, the face of a man who had caused extraordinary suffering and would answer for it. Sebastian's captain approached them. "The men are secured, Your Grace. Shall we ride for the magistrate tonight?" "At first light. Post a guard. No one sleeps until they are in chains." He looked down at Arabella. "I'm taking her to Hale Park. Send word to Lord Fenwick that his daughter is alive and unharmed." His horse, a tall black stallion with an intelligent eye, stood waiting at the edge of the clearing. Sebastian lifted Arabella into the saddle with the same careful strength, then mounted behind her. He unclasped his riding cloak and wrapped it around her shivering body, cocooning her in wool that smelled of leather and wood smoke, and him. "Hold on to me," he said. She leaned back against his chest and felt his arm tighten around her waist. Not possessively, but protectively, the way one holds something that matters. They rode through the dark forest at a steady pace, his men forming a silent escort around them. Arabella's mind swarmed with questions, but exhaustion and shock had flattened her capacity for speech, and instead, she simply let herself be carried, listening to the rhythm of the hooves and the steady beat of Sebastian's heart against her shoulder blade. It was perhaps an hour before the trees thinned and Hale Park came into view, its windows blazing with light against the darkness like a ship at anchor. Sebastian dismounted first and lifted her down. Servants materialized immediately, faces tight with concern, bearing blankets and lanterns and the particular urgent efficiency of a household responding to crisis. A woman with silver hair and kind eyes took charge. "I'm Mrs. Lennox, the housekeeper, my lady. Let's get you warm and fed and out of those clothes." Arabella allowed herself to be led inside and up the grand staircase to a guest chamber where a fire was already roaring. Maids appeared with hot water, clean linen, a nightgown of soft cotton. They helped her out of the wreckage of her wedding dress, and Arabella watched it fall to the floor in a heap of torn silk and broken pearls and dirt, and felt as though she were watching the last remnants of a life she had almost been foolish enough to choose puddle at her feet. She was sitting by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the flames without seeing them, when a soft knock came at the door. "Come in." Sebastian entered carrying a tray with tea and a small glass of brandy. He had changed into a simple linen shirt and dark trousers. His hair was damp, pushed back from his forehead. Without the riding coat and the dust and the pistol, he looked younger, less formidable, and she saw for the first time what she had been too young and too foolish to see 6 months ago, that his seriousness was not coldness. It was depth. It was the quality of a man who felt things so profoundly that he had learned to keep them beneath the surface, not because he lacked emotion, but because he had too much of it to safely display. "I thought you might need these," he said, setting the tray on the table beside her. She took the brandy and drank. It burned and then it warmed, and she felt the last of the trembling begin to subside. "How did you know where to find me?" she asked. He sat in the chair across from her. "Your father came to me. He rode straight from the forest to Hale Park, bleeding and half-conscious, and told me what had happened. He came to you, not to Philip." Something crossed Sebastian's face, dark and briefly unguarded. "He went to Ashcroft first. Ashcroft declined to pay the ransom. He suggested your father negotiate a lower figure." The words confirmed what Arabella had already known, but hearing them spoken aloud by another person made them real in a way that her own suspicion had not. She closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing the blow, then opened them. "And so my father came to you. He was desperate. He knew I had been tracking criminal activity in these forests for months, as part of the county magistrate's commission. I knew the terrain. I knew the likely hiding places." He paused. "I gathered my men within the hour. I only wish I had been faster." "You saved my life, Sebastian." His eyes met hers, and she saw the composure waver just for a moment, like a still pond disturbed by a single stone. "You owe me nothing. I would have torn that forest apart tree by tree if that was what it required." The silence that followed was dense with everything unspoken between them. Arabella set down her glass. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Not for tonight, for 6 months ago, for the library, for every foolish word I said to you. You were honest with me. I have never faulted you for that. I was honest about the wrong things. I told you I wanted romance and passion and excitement. I told you I needed someone who could match my appetite for society. And then I chose a man who gave me pretty words and abandoned me the moment those words were tested." She leaned forward. "You offered me respect and partnership and a life of purpose, and I was too young and too vain to understand what any of that was worth." Sebastian was very still. The firelight moved across his features, and she watched him wrestle with something behind his expression, some habitual restraint that was struggling to hold against the pressure of what he wanted to say. Arabella, he corrected himself, and the stumble, the first imperfection she had ever heard from him, made him suddenly, achingly human. "You were taken from a road today and locked in a cellar by men who would have killed you. You have been through something no person should endure. What you are feeling right now is relief and gratitude, and I would not want you to confuse those things with something else." "I am not confused," she said. "I have been confused for 6 months. Tonight I am finally thinking clearly." She stood and crossed to his chair and knelt beside it, taking his hand in both of hers. His fingers were warm and calloused, the hands of a man who did not delegate every task to servants. "You never made me a false promise, Sebastian. You never told me what I wanted to hear. You told me the truth every time, even when the truth was not what I was looking for. And tonight you rode into a forest full of armed men for a woman who had turned you down. If that is not love, then I do not know what love is." His hand tightened around hers. His jaw worked. And then, for the first time since she had known him, Sebastian Hale smiled. Not the measured half-smile she had occasionally glimpsed at social functions, but a real, unguarded, transformative smile that broke across his serious face, like sunrise over a landscape she had only ever seen in shadow. "I have loved you since the day I met you," he said. "I loved you when you refused me. I loved you when I heard you were marrying someone else. And I loved you tonight, riding through that forest, more afraid than I have ever been in my life. Not of the men or the guns. Afraid that I would be too late." He pulled her up from the floor and into his arms, and he kissed her. It was not the kiss of a man who lacked passion. It was the kiss of a man who had held passion in check for so long that its release carried the force of something elemental, deep and unhurried and certain. The kiss of someone who had waited and would have gone on waiting, but was unspeakably grateful that he no longer had to. When they finally separated, he rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said, "not because you are frightened or grateful. Marry me because you want to, because you know, as I know, that this is right." "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, toi." They married 4 weeks later in the chapel at Hale Park. It was a small ceremony, intimate and unpretentious, attended by family and a handful of close friends. Lord Fenwick, his head still bearing the faint scar from the pistol blow, walked his daughter down the aisle with tears streaming openly down his face, and made no attempt whatsoever to hide them. Arabella wore a gown of simple cream silk. No pearls, no inherited veil, no 3 months of fittings. She carried a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked that morning from the meadow behind the estate, and when she reached the altar, Sebastian was waiting for her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Not the composed, unreadable mask the world was accustomed to seeing, but something open and raw and luminous, the face of a man who had spent years guarding his heart and was, at last, willing to let someone in. Their vows were simple and meant. The kiss was tender and held. And when they turned to face their guests as husband and wife, Arabella thought she understood, for the first time, the difference between the love she had once imagined and the love that actually existed. The love she had imagined was performance, grand gestures, breathless declarations, the theatrical sweep of a story designed to be admired. The love that existed was quieter. It was a man who rode through a dark forest because he could not bear the thought of her being afraid. It was a hand offered without conditions. It was honesty when flattery would have been easier, and presence when absence would have been forgiven. That evening, as the sun dropped below the hills and painted the sky above Hale Park in shades of amber and rose, Sebastian took her hand and led her to the garden, to a stone bench overlooking the pond, where a pair of swans moved in slow, synchronized arcs across the water. He produced a small box from his coat and opened it to reveal a ring set with a deep blue sapphire circled by diamonds. "This was my mother's," he said. "She told me to give it to the woman who made me smile. I suspect she had given up hope." Arabella laughed through her tears as he slid the ring onto her finger. "I will treasure it. Not half as much as I treasure you." He pulled her close. "You have given me something I did not believe I would ever have. Not a wife. A home. A life that is not merely managed, but actually lived." She tilted her face up to his. "And you have given me something I did not know I needed. Not rescue, though you did rescue me. You gave me the truth. About love. About what matters. About the difference between a man who says beautiful things and a man who does them." He kissed her, slowly and thoroughly, as the last light faded and the stars began to emerge one by one above the garden. When they finally drew apart, he offered his arm. "Come," he said, "let us go home." They walked back toward the glowing windows of Hale Park, hand in hand, and Arabella reflected on the terrible, improbable, miraculous chain of events that had brought her from a gilded carriage on a forest road to this moment. She had been a bride that morning, dressed in silk and dread, riding toward a marriage built on charm and nothing else. She had been a captive that afternoon, alone in the dark, certain she would die. And she was a wife tonight, walking beside a man who had loved her long before she had the sense to love him back, and who had proven, in the only way that ultimately matters, that love is not what you say. It is what you do when the cost of doing it is high, and the reward for doing it is uncertain, and you do it anyway, because the person matters more than the price. Sometimes the person you need most is the one you overlooked. Sometimes the grandest love arrives without grand gestures, carried instead in steady hands and quiet courage, and the willingness to ride through darkness on the chance, just the chance, that you might arrive in time. Sebastian had arrived in time, and Arabella, who had once been foolish enough to want fireworks, had learned at last that the truest light is the one that burns long after the sparks have faded.